we're talking about theology, the theology of sexuality, the theology of gender. And I think this is really important that we approach this with a proper theological approach, because I saw a tweet today. This guy that I follow, he's a pastor, he's an author. His name is Dan White Jr. And he said this. He tweeted this. He said, "Many people don't live their theology; they live out of their fears and project them onto theology." Wow. Okay, I had to think about that. Many people don't live their theology; they live out of their fears and they project them onto theology. And so I had to, kind of think about that and realize, yeah, this is, I understand this is resonates with me. You hear something and it stirs up fear for our nation. Oh no, our country, and things are really bad. And so we live out of that fear. We project that fear on our theological beliefs, and we end up maybe putting up with things theologically that normally we wouldn't, accepting things that normally we wouldn't. I think we do it in politics. I think we do it when it comes to same sex, the transgender, homosexuality. I mean, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you have ever been afraid, like, oh, what is this country going to come to? They're taking over, and then we project that fear into our beliefs, our theology, and then it throws everything off. So I think it's proper, and I love that Dr. Seiler does this, begins with the theology. Here's what the Bible teaches. Here's what the Bible says, regardless of what the culture is teaching or which direction the culture is going. So that's what we're trying to do as we go through this book. So she talks in chapter 4. We're not gonna go through this chapter, but she talks about the chapter's titled "The Bible and Homosexuality." Did God really say? And so she goes through some passages that some progressive Christians, left-leaning Christians, she calls them revisionists because they want to revise, they want to change what the Bible really says. And last week I told you that they usually, these revisionists start off by saying, well, there's only 6 passages in the Bible that speak against same-sex behavior. 3 in the Old Testament, 3 in the New. And if you think it was going to be that important, there would be more than 6. But as we said last week, Dr. Seiler says in her book, that's because the Bible is not meant to necessarily to speak against same-sex relationships in that sense directly, but the Bible is written to reveal God. That's the purpose of the Bible, is the revelation of God. And so some of these people call these clobber passages because, sadly, there have been some Christians that have used these verses in a very harsh manner to criticize LGBTQ people. So what she does in chapter 4, she goes through all 6 passages and she explains what the progressive view is, and then she gives her response, or what the sound doctrine view is, explains those passages. So I'm not going to go over those. You can read those. That's some of the easy reading in this book. But let me ask you this question. Let me have you answer this: true or false? Okay, true or false? Jesus never talked about same-sex relationships in his teachings. True or false? Jesus never talked about same-sex relationships in his teachings. Anybody want to answer? If you don't want to answer, that's fine. I'm not going to force you. You think it's true? You think he did, so you think it's false. Okay. This is technically true. Technically true. He never addressed homosexuality. And that's what progressive Christians bring up. They say, hey, Jesus never spoke directly. That's why I said it's, technically true. He never spoke directly. He never mentioned homosexuality, of course, same-sex attraction. That's a newer term. So that's technically true, but just because he didn't mention it doesn't mean that it was okay or it's okay in God's eyes. And see, that's a point that revisionists make. They want to change the meaning of Scripture. They want to revise the understanding of Scripture. And so they say, Jesus never talked about it. So there. Like, okay, technically he didn't talk directly about it, but he didn't talk about other things that are clearly against God's law. Jesus never talked about incest. Does that mean it's okay? Jesus never spoke about sexual assault, rape. Does that mean that's okay? No. Did Jesus ever talk about pedophilia? Did he ever talk about abortion? No. Does that mean it's okay? No, it doesn't mean it's okay. See? So my point is that, we don't make a judgment based on what he didn't say directly. We should pay attention to what he did say. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So Jesus quoted Genesis 2:24. So he quoted Genesis 2:24 in Matthew. We're going to read Matthew 19. Jesus quoted Genesis 2:24. Paul quoted Genesis 2:24. And so when Jesus quoted it, we read it in Matthew 19:4. Look at this with me. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So what Jesus here is doing by quoting Genesis, he is supporting, he is affirming marriage between a man and a woman. And it's very clear. He's showing that same-sex relationships. He didn't say anything about same-sex relationships, but he's showing by affirming man and woman, husband and wife, he's showing that same-sex relationships don't have a place in God's original plan. Does that make sense? So he didn't mention it, and yet, so it's technically true. And yet, by what he did say, he's making clear what God's original design is. Right? Now, here's another thing. And I'm answering the question, because people will say, well, Jesus never talked about it. Well, let's not worry about what he didn't talk about. Let's worry about what he did say and what that covers, okay? The second thing is that Jesus spoke against all forms of sexual activity outside of marriage. And that would include same-sex behavior, but the same-sex behavior is not the only sexual sin that the Bible forbids, that Jesus forbids. He spoke against all forms of sexual activity outside of marriage. So look at Mark 7:20-23. He went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. Now, the Greek word for sexual immorality is a broad term that refers to any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage. Any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage. Now, regardless of what the government says, same-sex marriage is not a marriage in God's eyes. So that is sexual activity outside of marriage, and that is forbidden. That is a sin. All right. So again, Jesus didn't have to say directly anything against homosexuality. He just taught, what is sexual immorality, and same-sex behavior falls under that. Dr. Seiler says that people who would have heard Jesus say what we just read in Mark, they would have understood that word in the Greek that is translated sexual immorality. They would have understood that word to include all the sexual sins that are listed in the Old Testament. They would have understood that includes adultery, that includes incest, that includes bestiality, that includes homosexuality. And so, the arguments of these revisionists at first might seem convincing, but they don't hold up under examination. Um, and, you know, and Dr. Seiler says something in the book that I have found to be true. This is my opinion, that people who support, a lot of people, not everybody, uh, at least some people who support revisionist views, they do so because they're either trying to find a way to justify their own same sex behavior or attraction, or maybe they're trying to find a way to support a loved one's behavior, attraction. I've uh, heard the stories and even have heard ministers themselves whose child uh, announced that he or she was gay, and after a while, even the ministers at one time would preach the sound theology regarding sexuality, change their minds, and I think a lot of it had to do with just the relationship, the painful, as I'm sure it was, but also just a desire to either identify or justify their children's experience, and so it's a messy and it's heartbreaking situation that we deal with. Okay, so the next chapter, she talks about what science says. Uh, are people born gay or trans? That's the question that she poses in the chapter title. Are people born gay or trans? The subtitle, I think I gave my notes a subtitle simply because this is what she talks about. Is there a gay gene? Is there a gay gene? The bottom line, and I'm again not going to go through that chapter. Uh, you can read that on your own, but the bottom line, she says that despite many years of research on genetics, brain structure, prenatal hormones, scientists have not found, quote unquote, a gay gene. In other words, they haven't found a clear biological cause for same-sex attractions or transgender feelings. It's not there biologically. It's not somebody can say, "Well, I was born with that gene." There's no proof. Science has tried to prove it. I think they probably have tried very hard, but they haven't. She quotes one researcher or two researchers, Mayer and McHugh. They said there's the idea that sexual orientation is an innate, biologically fixed trait that people are born that way, air quotes, people are born that way, is not supported by scientific evidence. Right? This is what they've discovered. So, and I think that's important because I remember, probably 30 years ago, I was hearing a lot about this, There's a gay gene, people are, they can't help it. That's biologically, not emotionally, but biologically they're born gay. That's not true. There's no evidence of that. As hard as they've tried, I'm sure they're still trying to find that gene. So let me ask you this question. You can answer out loud if you're brave. If not, you could just let somebody else answer out loud. What percentage of adults do you think identify as LGBTQ? What percentage of adults identify as LGBTQ? Anybody want to venture a guess? Less than 3%? All right. According to the most recent Gallup poll, remember she wrote this book in 2023, so her figures are from 2022, which is, in terms of research, is very, very recent. The number of adults identifying as LGBTQ has risen in the last decade, from, in 10 years, from 3.5% in 2012 to 7.1% in 2022. So yeah, Mac was right on in 2012. Which by the way, I remember, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, hearing same-sex activists say, saying, oh, it's like way over 10% of the population which was never true, but they were trying to promote. Well, that's why we have to have gay characters in the sitcoms and the movies because they're such a big part of our population. And it turns out that it never was that high back then, but now it's doubled from 3.5 to 7.1. Why do you think there's been such a rise in people identifying as LGBTQ? Anybody have any thoughts? Why do you think it's doubled? Yeah, so one possibility is that our culture is much more accepting. It makes it easier to be openly identify as LGBTQ. I think that's pretty clear to see. But the increase, as far as Dr. Seiler, the increase isn't the same across all age groups. Which age group do you think is driving this increase? It's the younger adults, right? Those under 25, she says. And she says nearly 40% of 18 to 24-year-olds identify as LGBTQ, according to George Varna. And she says this tells us that there's something happening with younger people. And she says that George Varna believes that this has to do more with social acceptance than sexual attraction. Right. Just something that Mac just mentioned. It's cool. You want to be accepted. And I don't know if you caught the question in this poll was not what their actual desires were, but if they identified as LGBTQ. Not that they were, but did they identify? So that's really even a broader trend. There's pressures to identify a certain way. A lot of times, maybe those aren't really their innate sexual desires, but because culture is more accepting, because culture celebrates them. Maybe they identify in that direction. I know of young people that in middle school or high school identified as gay or lesbian, and now I'm thinking of a couple of girls, and now they're both, as far as I know, happily married. They have several children. So there, with the young people, there's some kind of pressure there. Now let's go on to the next part, because beyond the social pressures, there are some developmental factors. 3 common developmental factors that she says are seen in people who genuinely experience same-sex attraction. Talking about same-sex attraction. The chapter after this, she talks about transgender feelings. I don't know that we'll cover that chapter, but right now she's talking about same-sex attraction. So the 3 factors are these: gender nonconformity, adverse family dynamics, and childhood sexual abuse. These are 3 things that are factors in people who experience same-sex attractions. Gender nonconformity means not fitting into a traditional gender role, not fitting into the stereotypical gender role. For example, well, boys will be boys, so boys like sports. Girls will be girls, so girls like dolls. Okay, those are traditional gender roles. Well, how many of you know that there are boys that they're boys, they're masculine, but they don't like sports. That they're not interested in sports. Or girls who don't want to play with dolls. Right? So this is gender nonconformity. Now, does that mean that everybody who doesn't conform to the traditional gender roles is gay? No, it doesn't mean that, but it does. But what her research has shown is that a lot of people that are gay might have started with that. Maybe didn't start with that, but that was an issue. They just didn't fit. Now, that alone is not really a problem by itself, that they don't fit the gender roles. But it can lead to other problems because if a child's personality or a child's biological traits don't agree with with traditional gender roles and gender expectations, then what are their friends gonna do to them? If you have a young man he doesn't really like sports and maybe he's kind of small and maybe he has some feminine features, what are his friends gonna do? They're gonna make fun of him, right? They're gonna laugh at him. They're gonna call him names. They're gonna, he might be somebody who likes to cook. He likes, you know, just along with other traits, right? Or maybe there's a girl who doesn't conform to the gender roles, to the traditional gender roles. Maybe she likes sports. Maybe it has a deeper voice. Maybe she has kind of a broader build. I don't know how many of you watched the U.S. rugby team in the Olympics this summer. I don't know anything about rugby, but this story came out of this girl, and I can't even think of her name. But if you saw rugby, you might have seen her. She was a phenomenal player. She's built like, what's the word? Fornida, but she has these broad shoulders and these features, and she was awesome. She was strong. We say rugby's was it right? Yeah, it was rugby, and man, she was getting in there and leading the team to victory. But they did an interview with her, and she was crying because she got to be so well known during the Olympics. People started making fun of her, saying that she was a man. She looked like a man, so she must be a man. And then some people started saying she was transgender. They were accusing her team of cheating because she was really a man, pretending to be a woman. And so in this interview, she was crying and she says, I've dealt with this all my life growing up, all my life, because I've always been built bigger than the boys and so on. And so these cultural stereotypes, what they do is they make these gender non-conforming children feel different. They make them feel different, and they isolate them from their peers. They have a hard time making friends. You know anybody like that? That's probably the case. They have a hard time making friends because they're teased. So then they question themselves. Guy will question his masculinity, a girl her femininity. And so as they grow up, they feel that something is wrong with their sexuality, and they're growing up with this feeling. It's being reinforced by their friends, and maybe if they have parents that don't understand, maybe a father who's angry that his son doesn't like sports, and instead of encouraging, they make matters worse by criticizing and judging and so on. And so think about what that does to them mentally, to their mental well-being and their emotional well-being, and think of how that affects their sexual development. Now, one of the things that Dr. Seiler says several times in the book, over and over, she says that the brain and sexuality are closely connected. She says that several times. The brain and sexuality are closely connected. So that means that emotional trauma, like what these children are going through, or young people, it's going to affect how they respond to sexual images or stimuli. So they need to have, I'm already taking longer than I want to, but I want to finish this. For children to develop a healthy healthy sense of their sexuality, they need to develop healthy and meaningful connections with members of the same sex. Right? Young boys, little boys, remember that, how they have the no girls allowed in their clubhouse. And they don't like the girls. Dr. Seiler says, they don't like the girls because the girls have cooties. Right? But then they grow out of that. After they get a little older, they find the opposite sex interesting. And that's normal. But these gender non-conforming children, she says, often get stuck in the first stage. They never grow out of that, oh, girls have cooties type of, feeling, because they never fully connected with their own gender, because their own gender mocked them, or whatever the case might be. They felt different. They felt isolated. And so that makes them, she says, that makes them, because they never really connected with their male friends, that makes them, they still want to connect with their male friends. You know, all the other boys have grown up and now they like the girls, right? But this gender not conforming boy, he hasn't gone to that stage. He's still trying to connect with his friends and they're still pushing him away. There's this longing to connect and be accepted. And so then when they hit puberty, she says their desire for same-sex attraction, which they just wanted friends, but now they hit puberty. And oh man, you know what happens when puberty comes? Um, when they hit puberty, then that desire to be friends and be accepted by their same-sex friends suddenly mixes with their natural sex drive, and then it starts leading to same-sex attractions. There's so much going on in their minds. And then the last thing she says about this is, I don't know if it's the last thing, but the last thing I wrote down is that because opposites attract, then these gender non-conforming boys are drawn to masculine boys, or gender not conforming girls might be attracted to very feminine women. And so that's an issue that, that's a development that sometimes leads to same sex attractions. Then she talks about adverse family dynamics. I think this is maybe a little easier for us to understand that we've seen this. But she says that the long term studies over 40 years show that people with same sex attractions often have higher rates of difficult family situations. As she lists these: parents separating or divorcing. Right. How many times oh man, I would hear people say, oh, parents getting divorced, the kids will be okay. They're resilient. They'll bounce back. And some of them, to their adult years, they're still struggling with feelings of hurt and brokenness. And this study shows that in some cases, even same-sex attractions. Domestic violence, right? Those of you that are teachers understand, we see this, right? Neglect from parents, parents involved in criminal activities, physical and psychological abuse, living away from the same-sex parent, especially in the first 6 years of life, boys who have never met their father, girls whose mother died during adolescence. We won't say too much about this, except just because I think we get this in terms of how it hurts children, but maybe we haven't really put it together in terms of, and the data helps us to understand this in terms of how it affects children, what their families go through, and opens a door to some kind of same-sex attraction, because when their family structure is disrupted, they're the ones who suffer the most because they need the support from mom and dad, especially to feel secure in their sexuality. This is part of, she says, this is part of their psychosexual development. And so, not to mention, she says the fact that the devil is going to do all he can do to amplify these children's, the chaos in their minds. Can you imagine a little child, even a teenager, going through chaos at home, the family's falling apart. Sometimes the kids are the ones who are holding the family together, the parents are not making good decisions. And then, so all kinds of temptations. Somebody steps in because mom and dad aren't fulfilling the rules. An adult with evil motivation steps in and abuses a child, and then the child thinks, wow, maybe I'm gay. And the devil says, yeah, you are. The devil's always ready to amplify those misunderstandings. And so it's sometimes, I think what she's saying is, it's sometimes it isn't just a sexual issue, but it's an emotional, relational issue that becomes sexualized. See, this is where I have a hard time understanding that. And I've read and reread, and I've heard this before, but reading this book, okay, I really need to double down and try to understand this better. But I've heard this, she says it again, it's not just a sexual issue, but it's an emotional, relational issue that becomes sexualized. And so then these kids think, oh, I was born that way. Not realizing, no, it's just a wrong response to trauma in their life. Okay, so the third one, the last one, is this one: childhood sexual abuse. This is heartbreaking. We certainly understand how childhood sexual abuse can confuse children, right? Confuse them. And it is a lot more prevalent than we would like to admit. It's a lot more prevalent. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. Um, not not every and Dr. Seiler is very clear to make this point. Everybody responds to trauma differently. So not every girl, for example, who is abused is going to develop same sex attractions. Some might, but not everybody will. Some might become promiscuous with men, because it makes them feel in control, and that way they feel like they're not going to be a victim again. So don't want to get into the whole grooming. We hear so much about this, and uh, wow, it's just awful. And the children are the ones that get hurt, that get confused, and they respond to trauma incorrectly because they're children. So those are the three: uh, non-conforming, non-conformity, adverse family dynamics, and childhood sexual abuse. This book has been helpful to me. Just this chapter here, how same-sex attractions develop, because we normally don't think. I don't think that deeply. It's like, yeah, I mean, you chose the lifestyle, or I mean, even though I know that a lot of them they don't choose. I've heard people say, I don't want to have the same-sex attraction, and they're afraid for God to remove it. I understand that, but still, we're not aware of how deep the pain can be, or the trauma, all the emotional things that are going on in their minds as they grow up as children and so on.